Hi, this is Mrs. Schultz, and I'm going to run through a little bit of introductory information about prohibition before you start your primary source activity. Um, from 1920 to 1933, the manufacture, sale, and transportation of alcohol was prohibited by the 18th Amendment to the Constitution, and this time period was known as Prohibition. Today, we're going to examine the roots of Prohibition and then analyze some documents to figure out how supporters of Prohibition supported it or promoted it. Prohibition has its roots in the temperance movement of the 19th century. Americans were heavy drinkers in the first decades of the 1800s. By some estimates, Americans drank about 3 times more alcohol in 1830 than they do today. Criticism of alcohol consumption began to grow in the 1830s United States, and critics blamed alcoholism as the root cause of all sorts of problems like disease, poverty, child neglect, and domestic abuse. If only drinking could be curbed, many thought this country would be safer and more prosperous. From this sentiment, a social movement emerged promoting temperance or voluntarily choosing not to drink. The early temperance movement focused mainly on persuading people to reduce or completely stop drinking. Many temperance advocates in the early and mid 19th century saw drinking as an individual decision and not something that should be against the law. By the end of the 19th century, however, there were increasing calls for prohibition, which is a legal ban on alcohol. Groups like the Women's Christian Temperance Union and the Anti-Saloon League, or the ASL, began to lobby the government for laws that would completely ban alcoholic drinks. The prohibition movement was not universally popular. It had more support in rural areas than in cities, and Protestants were also more likely to view alcohol consumption as a moral issue than Catholics or Jews. And as a result, Protestant groups are more likely to embrace prohibition as a way to eliminate vice. The 18th Amendment. Prohibition advocates were first successful in passing laws at the state and local level, with over half of states enacting bans on alcohol between 1880 and 1920. Momentum for a national constitutional ban on alcohol grew in the second decade of the 20th century. In 1917, the U.S. House of Representatives and the Senate both passed the 18th Amendment with the two-thirds majority needed to send the constitutional amendment to the states for approval. 3/4 of states had ratified the amendment by the end of the following year, the minimum number of states needed for a constitutional amendment, and the Prohibition era had begun. Congress passed the Volstead Act the next year, which defined what qualified as an intoxicating liquor and provided resources for enforcing the law. Starting at midnight on January 17, 1920, the manufacture, sale, transportation, and importation of nearly all alcoholic drinks was illegal nationwide. Increasingly, however, the law did not outlaw the possession or consumption of alcohol. Interestingly, however, the law did not outlaw. It also allowed alcohol to be made and sold for use in manufacturing, medicine, and religious ceremonies, and these loopholes would make prohibition more difficult to enforce. So the question remains, why did many Americans support prohibition to begin with, and how did supporters of prohibition try to sell this idea? Today we'll look at some historical documents and try to answer the question, what were the arguments for prohibition? A couple of additional slides with information. The effects of prohibition. Contrary to popular belief, prohibition actually did reduce the amount of alcohol that Americans drank. By some estimates, overall consumption fell by 30 to 50% during prohibition, but prohibition was hardly effective in stopping the flow of liquor in the United States altogether. Some states refused to enforce the law, and in some cities on the East Coast, it was as easy to get a drink during prohibition as it was before. Prohibition also created a lucrative black market for alcohol. Foreign distilleries rushed to meet the demand of American consumers, and liquor poured into the United States illegally from Canada, Europe, and the Caribbean. American bootleggers, illegal producers of alcohol, also continued to make liquor throughout Prohibition, and large criminal organizations were built on the profits from the sale of illegal alcohol. Leaders of these criminal organizations, like Al Capone, Lucky Luciano, and Dutch Schultz, no relation, became infamous for brutality and violence. The 21st Amendment. Support for prohibition had waned by the end of the 1920s as people increasingly believed that the laws were ineffective. The onset of the Great Depression further eroded public support for prohibition as people began to embrace the idea that the legal manufacture of alcohol would create jobs. And many also believed that taxing the legal sales of alcohol could generate more government revenue that could then be redistributed to the poor through federal aid programs. The 18th Amendment was formally repealed with the passage of the 21st Amendment in 1933. Although some states continued to ban liquor after the 21st Amendment, the 14-year experiment with national prohibition had ended. Okay, go ahead and open the primary source documents and complete the activity. Turn that in when you're done. Thank you.